Not every global crisis reaches Main Street. Some stay on screens, in speeches in markets most people never touch. But when one is about to cross into ordinary American life, a few warning signs usually appear first, and they rarely begin where people are looking. They begin in the hidden costs of movement, in the language businesses start using, and in the quiet change of consumer behavior before the full pain is obvious. Reuters has already reported rising gas prices are straining U.S. households, and consumer sentiment has weakened as the Middle East war pushes energy costs higher. Because that is how a global crisis reaches Main Street. Not all at once, not with one dramatic headline, but through signals that build stack and start changing how ordinary people spend, plan, and worry. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you want coverage that explains how global crises turn into Main Street pain, subscribe and stay with us. And they rarely begin where people are looking first. In this video, Main Street does not mean the stock market, a cabinet room, or a headline on cable news. It means the people who feel a crisis in smaller, harder ways. The family watching gas take a bigger bite out of the week. The small business owner wondering whether to raise prices. The worker deciding which purchase can wait another month. Reuters reported that rising gasoline prices tied to the Middle East war are already straining U.S. households, and consumer sentiment slipped in early March as people grew more worried about their personal finances. That is why Main Street matters more than the headline. It is where a global crisis stops being information and starts becoming decision-making. It is where higher fuel costs become tighter delivery margins, where uncertainty becomes caution, and where fear begins to change behavior before any official recession label appears. NFIB's February survey still showed small business optimism near its long-run average, but uncertainty remained elevated, which is exactly the kind of tension worth watching when outside shocks start pressing inward. It starts when ordinary decisions begin to feel harder. The first warning sign is not just that energy jumps, it is that energy jumps and then refuses to come back down. A one-day spike can be noise. A high plateau is different. That is when a global crisis starts sending a message to Main Street. The pressure is no longer just on a screen. It is entering the cost of driving, shipping, cooling, and running a normal week. Reuters reported U.S. pump prices have surged since late February, with the national average nearing $4 a gallon, and a Reuters Ipsos poll found 55% of households say the increase is already hurting their finances, while 87% expect more pain ahead. That is why this sign matters so much. High energy does not stay inside gas stations. It leaks into diesel freight delivery surcharges, airline fuel math, and inflation expectations. The EIA says Brent is expected to remain above $95 a barrel over the next 2 months, and Reuters reported oil briefly surged as high as $119 this week as the Middle East conflict widened and markets priced in deeper disruption risk. And the real danger is not the first jump. It is the moment households and businesses start realizing this may not fade quickly. That is when energy stops being a headline and becomes the first layer of Main Street stress. And the next warning sign often comes from the people trying to keep goods moving. The second warning sign is when businesses start changing their language, not the headlines, the operating language. When companies begin talking about fuel surcharges, delayed shipments, longer supplier times, and price actions, that is the moment a global crisis is no longer sitting on the edge of the economy. It is moving through it. Reuters reported FedEx said its fuel surcharge system was absorbing most of the hit from surging oil, while warning that a further spike could still feed through into shipping costs. Reuters also reported U.S. manufacturers were already seeing input prices jump and supplier delivery times lengthen as oil rose and the wider conflict disrupted planning. That matters because Main Street runs on those hidden decisions. A small retailer does not need a war map to feel trouble. They feel it when inventory arrives late, when freight gets repriced, when the wholesaler stops promising the old timeline, or when a delivery company quietly adds a new cost layer. Reuters reported air freight rates have risen by as much as 70% on some routes since the conflict widened, while pharmaceutical shippers have been forced to reroute urgent cargo through longer and costlier paths. And the third warning sign is usually the one people notice too late. Behavior changes. Not on Wall Street, on Main Street. Families start delaying bigger purchases. They cut back on driving, postpone trips, switch brands at the grocery store, and talk about prices as if the next increase is already on the way. That is when a global crisis stops being a story people follow and becomes a mood they live inside. Reuters reported U.S. consumer sentiment fell in early March as the Middle East war drove gasoline prices higher, with the University of Michigan index slipping to 55.5, and households across income and political groups turning more pessimistic about their finances. This warning sign matters because it changes the economy from the inside out. Once people expect fuel to stay high and everything else to follow, they do not wait for official inflation reports to protect themselves. They start spending differently. Reuters/Ipsos found 87% of Americans now expect gas prices to keep rising, and more than half say the increase is already hurting their household finances. That is not just frustration, it is a shift in behavior waiting to happen. And history gives that fear weight. Reuters reported in 2022 that rising gasoline prices pushed families to delay larger purchases, showing how quickly energy pain can alter everyday decisions. Because once behavior changes, the story is already here. These three warning signs matter because together they show the exact moment a crisis stops being watched and starts being felt. High energy that stays high means the base cost of normal life is rising. Businesses talking about surcharges, delays, and repricing means that pressure is no longer trapped in oil markets. It is moving through freight, inventory, payroll decisions, and small business margins. And when households start delaying purchases or changing routines, the final transfer has happened. The crisis has crossed from headline into behavior. That is why these are not three separate stories. They are three layers of the same transmission. Energy is the first pulse. Business language is the second. Consumer behavior is the third. By the time all three are pointing in the same direction, Main Street is no longer standing outside the crisis waiting for official confirmation. It is already making smaller, tighter, more defensive decisions in response to it. And that is the moment a crisis stops being watched and starts being felt. This is the moment a crisis stops being watched and starts being felt. This is not a new pattern. It is a familiar one with different headlines. In 2022, Reuters reported that rising gasoline prices were already pushing U.S. households to delay larger purchases even before the full inflation story had finished unfolding. That matters because it shows how a global shock does not need to crash directly into Main Street all at once. It can arrive through one highly visible cost-change household mood and then start bending everyday decisions from the inside. The shipping side follows the same logic. The World Bank found that the Red Sea crisis increased travel times by up to 45% for cargo ships and 28% for tankers, while global supply chain stress rose sharply as longer routes and higher risk pulled logistics out of rhythm. That is exactly the kind of change ordinary people do not see immediately, but businesses do. And once businesses see it, they start changing prices, delivery, promises, and inventory behavior long before the public fully understands why. That is why the case study matters. The details change. One year it is oil, another year it is shipping, another year it is war risk and energy fears at the same time. But the transmission pattern stays remarkably similar. Energy rises, transport strains, businesses get cautious, and consumers begin to feel less secure about the month ahead. Reuters' latest sentiment report suggests that same sequence may already be starting again, and that is why the next few weeks matter. So, what should people watch next week and next month if they want to know whether this crisis is really moving toward Main Street? First, watch energy, and not just whether oil spikes, but whether it stays high. Reuters reported Brent settled above $103 this week, while the EIA said Brent could remain above $95 over the next 2 months if Middle East disruption continues. That is the difference between a scare and a squeeze. Second, watch the language of business. When companies start talking more often about fuel surcharges, delayed shipments, longer supplier times, and repricing, the crisis is no longer sitting at the edge of the economy. Reuters reported FedEx says fuel surcharges are helping shelter profits from rising energy costs, while air freight rates on some routes have jumped as much as 70% as the conflict disrupted trade routes and pushed up jet fuel costs. Third, watch consumers. Reuters reported U.S. consumer sentiment fell to 55.5 in early March as the war pushed gasoline prices higher and darkened views of personal finances. That matters because once households start expecting higher costs and acting more cautiously, the final transfer has already begun. By then, the warning signs are no longer warnings. That is the real high point of the story. Main Street usually does not get hit by one dramatic moment. It gets hit by three layers that build on each other until ordinary life starts feeling different. First, energy rises and stays high enough to change the math of driving, shipping, and basic cost of living expectations. Reuters reported gas prices are already hurting a majority of U.S. households, while the EIA sees Brent remaining elevated if the Middle East disruption continues. Then, businesses start speaking a different language. They talk about surcharges, delays, and repricing. That is not media drama. That is the operating system of the economy registering stress. Reuters reported FedEx is leaning on fuel surcharges to protect profits while manufacturers are facing higher input prices and slower supplier deliveries. And then comes the signal that matters most. Households change behavior. They delay purchases, pull back, and start living as if the next hit is already coming. Once that happens, the crisis is no longer sitting in headlines. It is shaping decisions in kitchens, stores, and small businesses. Reuters reported consumer sentiment has already weakened as fuel costs climb and households brace for more pain. The impact arrives before the official label does. In the end, that is what Main Street pain really looks like. It does not usually arrive as one explosion. It arrives as a sequence. Energy stays high long enough to change the math of ordinary life. Businesses start talking about surcharges, delays, and price actions because the strain is now moving through the real economy. And then households begin acting differently because they no longer trust the next month to feel normal. Reuters has already reported all three layers beginning to show at once: higher gasoline prices, hurting household finances, business logistics, absorbing more fuel pressure, and consumer sentiment weakening as the Middle East crisis keeps energy costs elevated. That is why a global crisis does not become a domestic one when television says it is big. It becomes domestic when ordinary people start changing how they drive, buy, travel, and plan. By then, the warning signs have already done their work. The crisis may still look foreign on a map, but in real life, it has already crossed the street, entered the budget, and changed the emotional temperature of everyday decisions. That is the moment Main Street stops watching history and starts paying for it. What this story ultimately reveals is that the most dangerous part of a global crisis is not always the first headline. It is the slow moment when people begin reorganizing their lives around uncertainty. They buy less confidently. They drive more carefully. They postpone more. They worry sooner. And once that starts happening across thousands of households and small businesses at the same time, the crisis is no longer somewhere else. It is here. That is the deeper lesson. A strong economy is not measured only by how markets open in the morning or how officials sound at the podium. It is measured by whether ordinary people can still live without constantly recalculating the basics. Reuters reporting on higher fuel costs, weaker sentiment, and growing cost pressure suggests that this is exactly the threshold worth watching now. So tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. And if you want more coverage that explains how global shocks turn into Main Street consequences, subscribe and stay with us.